So I guess I'm the, as a fourth person, I'm kind of like the cleanup person, and maybe the person that's supposed to try to make sense of this. And Peter sent out this title, which you may or may not have seen. It's Wisconsin, Why and What Can We Do About It? And actually, as I was writing notes, I actually circled the can, and I actually said should, vice can. And so I'm going to try to maybe, I don't know if I'll tie things together, but I'm going to start with kind of a story, maybe a personal story. Maybe not as good a story as what Jim had shared, but I grew up in Detroit, and everyone knows Detroit as what?
Motor City.
Motor City. All right, so as growing up in Detroit, I had family on both sides of the street, blue collar, white collar. So, I mean, when we'd have family events, like even weddings, sometimes they'd turn into fistfights. Oftentimes, people even talking past each other, and that's a lot of what we see going on. What's interesting is in growing up, my father went to school on the GI Bill and became a chemical engineer, and he tried to distance himself from the automotive industry, which, looking back, was probably a really good thing to do, particularly as I see like lots of strife within the family regarding this, because again, you couldn't buy certain cars. And lo and behold, I remember my dad at one point when the gas crisis hit, he bought a Datsun, a used Datsun. I mean, he might as well have been wearing that letter A in our family. And, well, what was interesting was that, well, he never worked in the automotive industry, but he worked as a chemical engineer, and but as an engineer, he was a white-collar worker. And so, as growing up, we'd always hear about the labor issues that were going on, and sometimes, as his plant would go on strike, and as a salaried worker, he'd always have to, break through the line, break through the picket line. And I remember this, that a couple times the Datsun would come home egged. And then at one time the Datsun came home with a broken window. And I know my mom, more so than my dad, was more upset about this. And the interesting thing is he never spoke ill will of the labor in that case, or anybody in the picket line in that. And he knew that they were standing up for something they believed in. And at the same time, as a salaried person, he had to go in and keep the plant functioning. What was interesting is I, too, was a GI Bill person and went to school, and then I went in the military. And it wasn't until after that, after military service, I actually went to education and teaching. And I found myself in Virginia. And what was interesting is I think people know a little bit about Virginia. Again, it's Thomas Jefferson's, the birthplace of, I don't know, democracy in a sense, but one of those early colonies. But it's also a right-to-work state. So when I was a public school teacher, union affiliation was pretty low. And I remember at the high school in the district I was teaching at, I'd say it was probably about 15%. And I remember, as a young teacher, or a new teacher, and I wasn't that young, I was approached by one of the union representatives and said, would you like to come join the union? And I remember saying, well, yes, I would. And so I turned my packet in and got my card. And I remember going to one of the early union meetings. It was interesting because in Virginia it was, again, small number of teachers, but it was all what I would consider the minoritized teachers. And ones who felt that the union was giving, possibly there's some potential there. I also had a colleague in school who happened to be from Pittsburgh, coming out of a steel town. I guess that may be some reason why he felt the need to. But I remember a colleague who wasn't part of the union actually said to me, he said, Jim, why would you join the union? Well, you're just throwing money away, and we're not getting paid that much anyways. And I remember kind of turning to him saying, somehow I feel it's within my blood. I feel that there's something about the organization that makes me feel proud, again, historically. And that's maybe one of the things I was thinking about, this historic aspect of this, why is Wisconsin important? And maybe I'm just echoing some of the things my colleagues have already raised. But what's interesting is that historically, again, thinking of teachers, and again, coming from a teacher ed background, teachers have always been fighting for this professionalism. And part of this professionalism of raising, their place within society, and some of that was fighting then for even maybe their glimpse of what the good life was. And maybe that was an increase in wages, maybe it was a reduction in class size so they could actually carry out their mission. But it was always about that need for, to voice a concern that whoever it was that was above them, the administration, wasn't looking out for their well-being. maybe looking out for the well-being of the students that they were serving. And so there's always been that history of teachers getting together, and it wasn't really called unions either. It was actually called professional organizations. And actually, I did a little bit of history myself and kind of went back and saw, okay, when was this? It was actually back in 1857 when was the beginning of what then became the National Education Association, the NEA. And it was in New York State when what was formed, I guess, was the National Teachers Association, was this call. And again, this is, over 150 years ago, but at a time when, maybe 1% of the population actually walked into a high school. So, I mean, the whole idea of public education was pretty young still. But one of the things that they were fighting for was this professionalism and their stake in this professionalism and the fact that they felt that they were contributing to society in some sense. And this kind of, again, this public service factor. And that they had a right to organize and they had a right to push for this professionalism, which really wasn't going to be given to them unless they fought for it. And that's what I think is going on here in Wisconsin. That's what we really need to keep our eyes on and be aware of. Now, one of the things that I wanted to, and kind of thinking about this, and as Terry brought up this aspect of, in public, for folks working security, you don't want them to be able to strike, and they have all kinds of clauses. Well, often educators are looked the same way. It's almost, there's expectations put on schools. There's expectations put on schools for 180 days a year where kids are going to be there, and that's where teachers are supposed to be working with them. And my gosh, that's, there's almost a civic right for people to go to schools. Well, it's often been looked down upon the fact for teachers to be able to strike. Again, because aren't they supposed to be serving the common good? They're supposed to be serving, the students, supposed to be serving in the communities. And in the same light, maybe not as hard as, say, the security aspect, but yet there's always been that sentiment. Well, I was thinking about this, and recently in class, we've been talking about, there's a Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire, in one of his last works called Teachers as Cultural Workers, which is a book that he probably published a couple years before he passed away. He was writing these letters to teachers, some of these things, these letters saying, this is what's important and things that you need to, these kind of words of wisdom. And when it came down to this issue of striking, and he wanted to be very clear about this. And he said, often teachers are framed as being surrogate parents for kids, okay? And as being surrogate parents, often from the public eye, they'll say, parents can't strike. You can't have parents strike their kids just because they don't like the conditions. And so, again, when you think of it as like, yeah, that's right. So if teachers are supposed to stand for parents, they shouldn't be striking or collectively organizing. But Paulo first kind of stepped back and said, well, wait a minute, that's not the role of a teacher. They're not that type of parent necessarily. And he said, really when we say that teachers shouldn't strike, really we're realizing something that we're really missing what the message we should be giving our students. And he said, when it comes down to teachers and their ability to collectively come together and stand for something they believe in, and whether it amounts to a strike over issues of wages and benefits or class size, whatever that may be, he said, what's important to realize is that having them not be able to stand together and forcibly speak their mind and fight for their rights, the right for the good life, whatever that right may be, if we tell them that they can't, what we're not allowing them to do is to teach one of the greatest lessons of democracy. And that democracy is about standing up for what you believe in. And oftentimes standing up for what may be considered the more marginalized, for those rights also. And again, that's the issue that's at stake here. That's at stake here in Wisconsin, is that as our colleagues across that border right now are standing up for what they believe is right, and for what whether it be the governor, Scott Walker, what he's trying to take away. What's interesting is 2 weeks ago, actually, with all this misinformation that's being passed around, organization that I belong, that I'm associated with, called the Forum for Education and Democracy, sent out a statement. And I guess it gets to the point of what we can do or what we should do, in a sense. And this statement, it's titled this, and actually I have a few copies if people would like to take one with them. It's called Busting Myths Instead of Unions in Wisconsin. And so this forum, the Forum for Education and Democracy, it's a think tank, it's a policy organization. Actually, it's not located in sexy Washington, D.C. It's actually located in Athens, Ohio, or actually not even Athens, actually outside of Athens. And because there's actually a high school principal who's actually one of the key conveners of this. But this organization has some of the great minds in education that are conveners within the organization. But they said, we've got to come up with a statement. We've got to come up with a statement that counters the misinformation that's being put out. And there's a couple myths that they said that we needed to counter. And the first one is that public employees in Wisconsin and elsewhere are overpaid. In which, as we all know, most folks don't go into education because we're looking to make the big bucks, or law enforcement, or work in fire departments, right? So overpaid. Second myth is that public employees aren't sacrificing their fair share. And it goes out and dispels this myth. The third myth is that high employee benefits got us into the budget mess. The fourth myth was the state retirement system is in trouble, and this is in the state of Wisconsin. And then the fifth myth was that the governor has no option. What's interesting, again, as they said, we need to come out and confront this misinformation. At the bottom of this statement it says, nobody's saying that challenges in Wisconsin or any other state are easy, but solutions are best found through collaboration rather than confrontation, and by using facts rather than myths. And that's what we, as an educated population, need to do, is to counter those myths that are being put out there against the right to form unions, the right to request a piece of the good life with benefits, whatever it may be. And that's a part of our democracy, and that's a right that's in danger right now. And maybe, Wisconsin could be a domino. And that's why it's important for us to keep the conversation going.